different academic disciplines such as economics, political science, sociology, and public health focus on different dimensions. But the interrelatedness of these dimensions, of these forms of inequality, force researchers of different disciplinary traditions to face each other in order to face inequality. This is the reason IIP has convened the present series, jointly with the History Department at GW. I want to thank IIP affiliates, Trevor Jackson. Trevor, are you there?
Yes, James, I'm here.
Okay, great. Hey. And Brian Stewart for initiating the original series, which has morphed into the current online format. Now, a few words about today's speakers. Brooke Ackerly is professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, with appointments in philosophy and in law and in human and organizational development in Vanderbilt's top-rated Peabody College of Education and Human Development. She is also affiliated with Vanderbilt's Women's and Gender Studies program, critically examining the intersection of our many identities from the perspectives of many disciplines. She's also co-editor-in-chief of the International Feminist Journal of Politics, and her latest book, Just Responsibility, A Human Rights Theory of Global Justice, published by Oxford in 2018, received the 2019 Victoria Schuck Award of the American Political Science Association. On a personal note, we've spent many hours discussing multidimensional poverty and power as part of a group on religion and economy, and I learned many things from her. She also introduced me to the work of my future co-author, Sabina Alkire. Sabrina McCormick, who is our first discussant, is Associate Professor of Public Health at GW's Milken Institute School of Public Health, where she focuses on climate change and public health through the lenses of sociology and filmmaking. She was lead author on a special assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was informed by her extensive work on the public health effects of heat and other extreme events. You may have seen the result of her work as producer on segments of the Showtime series, The Years of Living Dangerously, that won the Emmy for Best Documentary Series in 2014. Welcome. Stephen Smith is professor and chair of the Department of Economics at GW and professor of international affairs at GW. Among his other influential work as development and labor economist, he has co-edited a special issue on the economics of adaptation to climate change in low-income countries, and is a member of the BRAC USA Advisory Council. He just released the 13th edition, just got it in the mail, Stephen, thank you, of his best-selling textbook with Michael Todaro entitled Economic Development. My interview with Stephen on what's new in development can be found on IAP's YouTube channel. And now for the presentation entitled Just Governance, Lessons on Climate Change Justice from People in Poverty. You'll have around 35 to 40 minutes. Take it away, Brooke.
So, wow, this is an honor. Thank you very much. And you are my first virtual public talk. And that's particularly important to me because I've been working on climate for a very long time. And whenever I've been asked if I would please come and give a talk on climate, I'd say, no, thank you. I'd really prefer to do this virtually. This is the first time where the invitation itself came virtually and I was able to do it. So thank you very much for all your leadership in many ways. And this is the most organized institute that I've worked with in a bit. So particularly grateful for that. I join you today from Nashville, Tennessee. We are on the land of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Cheek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek peoples. And the U.S. government negotiated treaties for us to cede that land, or for them to cede that land to the government just after Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which therefore enabled larger plantations to grow cotton, and all of the growth that we know came about in this area as a result of that. And then, of course, in 1830, with the Indian Removal Act, most of, but not all of, the Native peoples who lived here were removed. So now those tribes live and have national lands in North Carolina, in Mississippi, and mostly in Oklahoma. I have lots of thank yous. First of all, to the Institute for bringing me here today, of course, and for Professor Foster, who's been a colleague for such a long time, just about when I was starting this project. This is the photograph of my children at the age they were when I started this project. They are now in college. So I've been working on this for a long time. And as a result, I have a lot of caregivers to thank. I won't list all of their names, but please recognize that most spring breaks, most summers, I spent most of the pre-monsoon season in Bangladesh to develop this work. But it wouldn't have been possible to pick this area without the help of Gauranga Nandi, who's a journalist standing above Veena DaCosta, who was there watching a man map out how to get to India from where we are in this site, which is Bangladesh, southwestern Bangladesh. And the reason why migration was the beginning of the project is because we were originally funded by the Office of Naval Research. The Office of Naval Research, we are grateful to recognize, supports primary research, so not necessarily explicitly mission critical, but the mission critical aspect is that the Navy is one of the world's humanitarian providers. They arrive when coasts are jeopardized. In order to understand the physical dimensions of the relationship between climate change and social change, which was the combined call that funded this project, I worked with Stephen Goodbread, who's a hydrologist and river morphologist, and he's also taught me a lot about tides, and Jonathan Gilligan, who's taught me a lot about climate. And we here are on a walk where I'm teaching them a lot about being an anthropologist. Our qualitative work, which I'll share with you shortly, was led by Labib Anam, who's in the middle there. We are taking a day off to hike into the Sundarban and see this 500-year-old tiger temple. And the quantitative research was led by Bishrajit Malik. He is currently in Dresden, Dresden University, and Bishrajit is currently at the University of Brisbane, both of whom have received their PhDs since they started working with me. That's how long we've been doing this. So I'm going to take you to the coast of climate change. This is an area that is familiar to many, or at least familiar in your imaginations, because we are the site of three very commonly invoked ideas of when climate change is going to happen, or what causes the environment people will have to endure as a result of climate change. And the slow onset events are sea level rise, changes in livelihood, and saline inundation. We often think these are in nearly every politician's argument about why we need to attend to climate change. There are also sudden onset events, cyclones, floods, and heat waves. And I would also be happy to talk with you about the complexities related to those. But I'm going to focus in the talk on the first three, which are the slow onset events, those that I think are most familiar to folks. What I'm going to argue today is that often we are asking the wrong question when we ask a question about what is climate change justice. And the reason we ask the wrong question is because we think we know what kind of problem something is before we look at it. Now, the area of climate change is not the only place where this happens, but I'm going to take us a step back and say and ask us to ask, what kind of problem is climate change justice? What kind of problem is it that causes these three events? Or let me share the common narrative. These three events, these three consequences of climate change, sea level rise, changes in livelihoods, and saline inundation, cause harms to some people, often those who don't or didn't contribute to the greenhouse gases, often people who live in circumstances which are well beyond their control for other reasons as well. But that it also makes likely the probability that those folks will have to migrate, and that also is not a just burden of the consequences of climate change. So that's the familiar story. And I want to ask, is that really the right question to be asking? who should we be asking? Well, I don't think we should be asking politicians like Sheikh Hasina, but she will give you that common narrative that I just articulated. And I don't think we should be asking political theorists, though I am one, and so is Simon Caney. Simon Caney is a great political theorist, and he's done a lot of work to help us understand the distributive justice dimensions of climate change. But I think he's asking the wrong question, or rather, too small a question. Because really what I think we ought to be doing is asking the people who live and in fact struggle against their life circumstances that are indeed changing as a result of climate change. And it would be helpful if we could look to those who are currently experiencing the conditions that we anticipate being much more widespread. And that is in southwestern Bangladesh. So I went and worked with activists and communities who are on the coastline of climate change. If we were to ask academics, people who focus on commons problems see the climate as a very good example of a commons problem. People who think about commons problems, but the way in which local institutions affect what we can do with regard to commons problems are also bringing a lot to help us understand this issue. I talked about political theorists who are approaching it primarily as a distributive justice problem. There are also just political theorists who are saying this may be a consumption problem. We may have within our liberal democracies an assumption that we can grow our way out of any problem of inequality, and that may need to be problematized in the context of climate change. And then we've also got a set of political theorists who are thinking about norms and how we come to share common values. But I'm going to take you down a different path today. I'm going to introduce you to grounded normative theory, which, in addition to using empirical data to understand problems, we use empirical data to understand what kind of problem we should be thinking a particular life experience is. So, who made this mural? This is a mural made by a community to recognize and honor an anti-shrimp activist who was killed in their region when resisting the growth of the shrimp industry. To simplify the narrative of a 30-minute talk, I am going to focus on shrimping, but the meaning and the import of what I'm talking about is not reserved primarily to shrimping. The shrimping, in order to get the story across, often is the part of the political economy that gets highlighted, and I too will highlight it. And here's how I'm going to highlight it. So in addition to looking at activists, I think we should look at how people actually live and see what that tells us. So this is a photograph that I took sitting on a boat to have low impact on communities. I do my research from a boat. I am looking at the backside of what's called the hanging village. And this hanging village is surrounded by two rivers. So I'm on one of the rivers, and then I'm going to sail south to the right and go around, come back up to the north, and on the right will be that forest in the distance. I want you to notice all those little boats are about the same size, and I want you to notice the blue nets there. I'll give you a hint. Those are illegal nets that are going to catch and as a result, catch a lot of bycatch as well. But it's one of the most lucrative enterprises one can be in Bangladesh. They call this little town Little Kuwait, because you can earn in 2 months here what a person can earn by going to Kuwait and working there. On the other side of that row of houses, you'll see a shrimp pond. Then you'll see a little embankment and a little house. That little house is to shade the person who's going to survey the shrimp pond, make sure that you don't steal any of their shrimp while they're growing up from little larvae to be big shrimp. Behind that little shelter thing is another shrimp pond. Over to the left is another shrimp pond. Where you see the row of houses, that's another embankment against a river. Then there's going to be the river, and that row of trees there, that's the beginning of the Sundarban National Forest, a World Heritage Treasure, national treasure, and natural treasure, and I hope you all get there one day. So the thesis of the argument is that climate change justice is a problem of governance. It's a problem of governance in the most multi-level, multi-sided, multidisciplinary, and colloquial meaning of the word. I want to be talking about governance gaps and misgovernance along the way. So to foreshadow where we're headed here, what matters to a grounded normative theorist is what people say with both their words and their actions. And what they say, though they sometimes use the word climate change to describe it, and what they do is demonstrating that they are experiencing a lot of environmental change. They are experiencing that environmental change, and also different entities, foreign aid, local government projects, internationally funded local government projects, in which they have very little voice. And when they seemingly are offered voice, there is very little accountability to what they say about what's not working in the things that have been constructed or the ways in which they're being implemented. So from a policy perspective, what this means is that big donors, whether they be aid organizations that work independently, whether they be large philanthropists that are making big moves in the climate area, or whether they be government ministries like the Dutch Foreign Ministry, which will play a big feature in the story today, they need to be paying attention to governance. Because paying attention to anything else without paying attention to governance is going to be missing the mark, or so these folks will teach us today. I'm going to quickly introduce grounded normative theory, quickly introduce this study and its complexity, about how you study complexity when you don't know what the question is going to be. Remember that. I didn't know what the question was going to be when I started this. It's really important to get the empirics right. I'll achieve my goal today if I have shifted your thinking about those three things, and to understand them as not well understood if we focus on how they manifest at that superficial level, but we really need to understand the more complex political economy behind those three things. And then I'll revisit those theoretical characterizations and show why a governance argument is more appropriate. So grounded normative theory has been around a long time. Calling it this, that's the new thing. But we see it in democratic theory. Jenny Mansbridge does it in the 80s. We see it in critical theory. Jim Tully calls for us to do it at the beginning of this millennium. Pragmatists do it. Feminists have been doing it since the dawn of time. Indigenous researchers have been doing it since the dawn of time. But to think about it, it's better not to look at a grounded normative theorist. It's better to look at struggles. When you hear a feminist making a feminist argument, or a racial justice activist making a racial justice argument, they are doing normative theory as they make their claim. They are certainly making empirical claims about police brutality and disproportionate use of force against people of different races. But when they do that, they are making normative arguments about what should be happening. And that's where the normative theory comes out in struggle. You can also see it in queer struggles. Big week to acknowledge that. You can see it in human rights contestation, both the right to make a rights claim and then the substance of the right itself. Labor rights, for example, recognizing that domestic workers have labor rights as well. So the idea is to turn to people in struggle and see what they tell us. So how do we do that? Well, first, it means that you're thinking about the power of epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do I know? How do I claim the difference between what I say I know and what I say is my opinion? When you say, oh, that's an objective argument or that's a subjective argument, you are using your power of epistemology. Now, if everybody agrees with you and says, oh, yes, that is an objective argument. Oh, yes, that is a subjective argument. If they're agreeing with you, then you have the power of epistemology. But if you make an argument and somebody says to you, and you think you're making an objective argument, and they say, no, that's a subjective argument. Why? That person doesn't have the power of epistemology, but you do, or whoever wins that is the one with the power of epistemology. So we need to recognize up front, before we can talk substantively about what is inequality, we need to talk about who has the power to say what matters when we try to calculate, think about what is inequality. So we've got to be problem-driven when we're doing grounded normative theory. We have to be talking about real things and real people, because there have to be things that we can measure. But we can measure them with all kinds of empirical data. So it could be qualitative data and quantitative data. It can be discourse analysis. It can be looking at people's actions, photos. I've read memoirs of different projects, a lot of different possible sources. But the key is you're not done until you're done. It's a recursive process. The process does end because Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to share the benefit of having done the research, and all the expense of the research would be lost to the machinations of one's mind. But it has to be a recursive process. Ergo, I began with a lot of data. 12 sites of preliminary qualitative data, 26 sites of survey data, all of which were located around sites of particular water distress. 12 of those 26 sites, all 26 sites got a water project, hence the dress. 12 of those 26 sites got a follow-up ethnographic study to find out if that water project worked. There was nested within that an experimental design, which I'll foreshadow, was not going to be talking about that. It failed because they all failed. So there wasn't the variability that we were expecting to have generated by the experiment. And then all of these data are geolocated. So, obviously, physical science data on each site. So how much data is enough? Enough is enough. Once we were able to focus in on what actually, where the pressure points were, then we were able to drill down. And I'll illustrate now, not the process of analyzing the data, but merely the conclusions. So I promised you 3 arguments. I'm going to start with the one that's most familiar. Also, this will enable me to introduce the geology of the place where I've been working, and I'll introduce you to some of the people. So the normal story is climate change is causing sea level rise. In this area, it's very common for people to talk about climate change affecting Bangladesh, and they'll do what's called the bathtub model, where they just show where the new coast of climate change will be. I can, with the Q&A, I can talk about why that's not going to be exactly right for Bangladesh. I'm going to be all right for Bangladesh, but I can talk to you about that. What is true is that sea level rise is happening. What's even truer is that the scale at which we are witnessing sea level rise right now is in centimeters. The scale at which we are experiencing the threat of tidal inundation is in meters. So in the area where I'm working, they are already experiencing a 3-meter tidal prism daily. That means they are already experiencing what people anticipate in the future will be the worst condition that's related to sea level rise. Why are they experiencing that? Well, it's not just nature. It has a lot to do with the embankments, and I'm going to explain that to you. So I'm assuming that most of the audience is in Virginia and Maryland. And so what I want to point out is that we are talking about a country that's about the size of Virginia and Maryland combined, but they are at the foothills of the Himalayas, which is about 3 times the size of the Rocky Mountains. And they receive the amount of water that is about from the 2 river systems, the Padma and Ganges and the Brahmaputra, which come around the front and the back of the Himalayas respectively. They get about 4 times the water. So we are talking about of the Mississippi, 4 times the water of the Mississippi. So if you take a lot, we have more rivers in the United States than the Mississippi, obviously, but if you take our biggest river, our biggest mountains, and put Virginia and Maryland right up against them, you've got nothing still compared to what the Bay of Bengal experiences. But how do they experience it? So this is what I've learned from my river morphology colleagues. So as the water comes down out of the Himalayas, it's carrying sediment, but by the time it gets to this area, it's moving pretty slowly. So that you'll notice what you're looking at is the coast here, all of that cloudy light blue, that's sediment being pushed up toward the shore. You'll see that there's no big river. Well, on the far right, to the east there, you see that big river coming down. But to the left, to the west, you're seeing that the largest things are coming from the mouth of the Bay of Bengal going up. So basically, with the tributaries coming down, the subsidiaries coming down and the tidal prism being pushed up, those 2 forces carve islands. The Dutch government has had a long history, starting in the 50s and 60s, of support, even before this country of Bangladesh existed, of supporting building embankments around the boundaries of these little islands. Now, when you do that, you do end up embanking some smaller tributaries, turning canals into rain catchment, so that you could catch fresh water in the interior and grow agriculture. As a result, this absolutely contributed to a green revolution being able to happen here. Would not have been able to happen the way that it did if they hadn't done that. And the idea, of course, is to protect the land and the agriculture and sources of livelihood from the storms. So this is what it looks like, the embankments over the satellite image. Now, I want you to imagine or remember back to the study of conservation of momentum from high school, and picture the water coming in with the tides. As the tide rises, normally it gets diffused over the mangrove forest. That's that dark green there. That's the Sundarban. But as you get up north of the Sundarban, the tide can't disperse because of the embankments. So there'll be some sediment deposits that happen outside the embankments, but most of that water is going to head north up those rivers. And it creates a high tidal prism, and it creates water coming, intertidal water, so brackish water, coming much further north than it ever did before. So that is why I want to focus on the building of the embankment system as the beginning of the source of a misgovernance and governance gap problem. The polder system dominates both the physical and social landscapes here. When you need to build a new polder, it is a great source of day labor employment. You can do it just with clay as long as it's not a high erosion site. If you need to do it with cement, that's going to involve bringing in saline sand that is not has not been exposed to salinity, because if you've ever salted something that had cement in it, you realize that releases the saline, and cement don't mix. So it's well made with clay, but for high erosion places, you need to use cement. And together, this has constructed the landscape on which people in this region live. So is this a story of sea level rise as a result of climate change? Well, if you focus on that, you're going to miss the politics of what's actually happening. You're going to miss the global pressure to choose embankments as the way to deal with this problem. But there are other ways to deal with this problem, other local ways that people have been doing for centuries and that they are exploring now. You are going to miss, if you focus on sea level rise, something that happens due to climate change beyond our control, then you're going to miss the local governance role in developing these polders, because there is an economic interest in having these grand development schemes funded by the World Bank, or in this case, formerly funded by the Dutch ministry, now in partnership with the World Bank. You're going to miss the locally exploitable power relations that get completely obfuscated when you're looking at a satellite image, or in this case, a map image from this distance. Who gets to control what happens inside those embankments? Who gets to control that? It'll surprise you that the local hierarchies are what determine that. There's one exception that I hope you ask me about in the Q&A, but it's an exception that proves the rule. You also have unaccountable construction. Who has an interest in whether you use cement or day labor? Who has an interest in how these things are built? Also has an interest, is also not unrelated to the power dynamics of how they're used on the inside. And then all of these conditions result in exacerbating inequalities. So I'm going to argue that to focus on the climate change, the impact of climate change as being about sea level rise misses all of the social and political dimensions that are also contributing to what it's like to experience the consequences of climate change. And that those related to climate adaptation, whether you're thinking about them in terms of their relationship to climate mitigation or adaptation, are the source of the problem. The second example that I offer you here today, and we'll talk more about it in the Q&A, is that of loss of livelihood. This is a common narrative. I can illustrate the point because obviously your sources of livelihood in a place covered by shrimp ponds is much different than the variety of options you have in a place that's as lush as where I was before. So what is the difference? I'm going to argue that it's not just climate change causing this loss of livelihood, but rather it's shifts in the global and local political economy, some of which are the consequence of misgovernance and governance gaps. And if those are not fixed, then your climate justice strategy, whether it be mitigation centered or adaptation centered, is also going to be subject to the same problems of unjust governance. I'm going to breeze these through. That's the Sundarban, that's daily fishing. When I first started my work in Bangladesh, there was a cliche of families saying that you could fish for a day and feed your family for a week. And now these folks cynically say I could fish for a week and I couldn't feed my family for a day. That has to do in part with juvenile bycatch from these little Kuwait businesses. That's the top image there. The lower left image is bycatch caused by really low-wage workers pulling to get fish fry for their shrimp fry to start the shrimp farming. You get more people working in seasonal migration, bringing home payment in rice, so they're sure to feed their families. You get increasing reliance on that seasonal migration, which is made possible by these post-cyclonic construction projects so that women can work, support their family while their husbands are away. It makes for a beautiful landscape, I'll tell you, in the areas where they are resisting shrimping. Both watermelon and sunflowers are fabulous, but this is where those folks go to work that next. Okay, I told you that. Okay. So the story here is the same, though I sped through it, which is that global pressures, some in terms of demand for the fish, demand for shrimp, national misgovernance, that is second to the garment industry. When this business took off, that was the source of income, foreign exchange income. Again, though, locally exploited power relations and exploitable power relations and decision-making. Who gets to decide what happens in these interior canals, whether it's going to be fresh water that feeds people's fields locally or shrimp water that means only shrimpers can do it. That is the misgovernance and governance gap related to exploiting hierarchies and decision-making around those embankments and what's used on the inside of them. We've got issues related to construction. And again, the inequalities created by this exacerbate local inequalities. In the case of shrimping, remember that little house I said that you had to, somebody would sit out there and survey and make sure nobody stole my shrimp? Well, if you think about local power inequalities, you don't want to grow you can't hire the lowest wage worker in your community because that person is very low on the social hierarchy. So if some other people further up the hierarchy come by and steal the shrimp, what are you going to do? You actually don't have power to do your job. So often those little huts are filled with people who are from outside the community. They use the word muscle men or thugs to describe them. And you see in some of these communities, you see increased violence and a larger sense of insider and outsider. So the other story that people tell about shrimping is that it has caused saline inundation. And what I'm going to teach you today is not so much. It's not really a story about saline inundation. It's really a story about surface water management. Why is that? There are two sources of the water quality that we have here. The first is that unlike Kansas, where fresh water was captured in the Holocene period, in this area, the aquifer itself is saline. Now, it's not evenly saline, but it was saline water that was captured in the Holocene period. Now, because of what I was telling you before about the river morphology and some other things too, I didn't talk to you about this. So also, you probably remember from third grade that you learned that rivers get wider and wider and wider over time, and they move slower and slower and slower, and then they avulse. They start flowing in this new way. You've studied the Mississippi, you know that the Atchafalaya and the Mississippi are managed to avoid that avulsion and to manage the amount of water technically going down either side. Over time, they do avulse, and so you've got this empty, dry canal, or former river, which then gets filled in with the sediment coming down out of the Himalayas. So as a result, when you sink a tube well in this area, and it's true across the country, you don't know if you're going to sink it in a saline portion or a freshwater portion of the aquifer, and you don't know if there's going to be high arsenic or low arsenic in that area. And then manganese is another health-related chemical that also appears in their water. So for this area in particular, you cannot rely on the water table. You have to rely on surface water management. And so the real story here related to governance is that by treating this problem as one of saline inundation, you are absolutely treating the wrong problem. This is completely a story about how do we manage the water we have when we do have fresh water. So to illustrate the point, this is just the salinity map, but I have one for the manganese and the arsenic as well. What you may or may not be able to see is these are the 70 sites of which I picked 26 to do, or the physical scientists actually selected the 26 so that we have variability on all of the variables. But when you see those dots on top of each other, that means it's so close to each other. You've got a saline well and a not saline well. All of these sites are sites that were selected because they have a level of salinity that's appropriate for implementing a solution to the pond sand filter problem. So pond sand filters are excellent. They're not that expensive to build. You can build a lot of them. Ask any development organization who works in this area in Bangladesh. They build a pond sand filter program, costs very little money. You can say you built a lot of them, marvelous. And they're pretty easy to manage. You just clean out the sand regularly. I've got some great stories about who cleans it, how often, and I call it the Anna Karenina principle, because when they're working, when they're not working, they're all not working for the same reason. When they're working, there's always a particular story about why they're working well. So the pond sand filter is great, except remember what I said about that water. So if you've got any kind of breach in embankment, a storm surge, cyclone, that those embankments can be breached or overtopped. And if they ruin your surface water, then you cannot use the pond. You can't clean the pond's water in order to have fresh drinking water. So a pond sand filter relies on a healthy, not too saline pond. Usually that fills with rain catchment. But as I mentioned before, you could use the canals that are interior to these embankments if you wanted to, if you had any control over them, which you don't, so nobody does. So what's the difference? Why is it that some places you have pond sand filters that work just fine, like this lovely lady? And why is it that some places you have two side by side not working? I mean, this may be a perfect poster child for what's wrong with development today. There was a pond sand filter there. Why wasn't it repaired? Why is it that somebody paid to build a new one right next to it to bring water out of the exact same pond? That's the story of the levels of governance problem, right? A donor has a certain kind of benefit from building that they don't have from funding fixing or community management or whatever. So anyway, but not even if you had those functioning, you'd still have the problem of what happens if this pond next to the pond sand filter gets destroyed. Enter Kazi Matan. Dr. Matan is a geologist in Bangladesh and colleague and collaborator on this project. Why do we work together? Because he is a geologist who has brought this technology from Africa and introduced it to Bangladesh. What that blue thing is a very big water reserve. So you pump water out of that freshwater pond into the aquifer, and look how cool this is, into the aquifer, and it creates a little bubble. I'm sorry I don't have his little images. He has these images that illustrate that you can have a freshwater bubble within a brackish aquifer, and then you can pump it back out. Now you have to pump the water in order for it to be there to pump out. So you have to pump it in when there is fresh water, and you never get out as much as you pump in. But that is a way of protecting the water source through the monsoon season. And that is why we cited these projects in these very vulnerable water places. So I guess I should not give away the punchline. Remember when I said, or not miss the punchline. So remember when I said that we had the built-in experiment, that didn't work because none of the projects were working? So this woman who was happily pumping water at the Mar, she was in one of the pilot sites. But in 100% of the sites where we studied, and we did follow-up ethnographies, we found that due to construction problems that were reported. However, there is a 16-step process between reporting and when a concluding action happens to restore them. And you have only a 2-year warranty on these, which means you're really exposed to only 2 seasons of the weather. And remember what I said about the problem with bad cement and salinity? If they've made these out of anything that's got saline cement, you're not going to make it for your, it's going to live just about 2 years and then collapse after that. So for one reason or another, none of the 26 were functioning at the end of the study time. And that's why it's not wrong to say that climate change is causing sea level rise. But it is more right to notice that it is the embankments and the tidal prism and storm surges that are making people vulnerable to the water now. It's not wrong to say that saline inundation is a consequence of climate change. But it is wrong to focus on that consequence rather than on the governance problems that are going to have to be resolved if we're going to be able to deal with any of these problems at either the, certainly at the mitigation level, but also at the adaptation level. And that's why I think it is better to focus on the governance problems specifically, the shift in political economy, the embankments, the shift in political economy, and the challenge of managing surface water, all of which are political problems that have physical science dimensions. They are all complex problems of governance. So while academics give us this normative argument, and I'm going to accelerate so I can come to a conclusion, or rather be brief so I can come to a conclusion. Well, academics give us these arguments about what kind of problem climate change justice is. I've been arguing that it is actually a problem of governance, a problem of misgovernance and governance gaps. And the reason why I think it's important to look at it that way is because it has very consistent and differently directive attention to what kinds of problems need to be solved in order for your plan of climate mitigation to be effective. So grounded normative theory teaches us that taking responsibility for climate change justice means taking on climate change justice as a problem of governance, a multi-level global governance challenge where political decision-making happens at all of these levels. And if we don't have voice and accountability at all of these levels, then we are not going to be able to take on the question of climate change justice, no matter how good your models of climate change and its consequences are. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the talking part of my talk with a slide of, forgive me, I actually do not know if this is sunrise or sunset. I should know that. Let's pretend it's sunset. I get this view twice a day when I'm doing my work in this region. It is a beautiful place to be, and I want to counter Henry Kissinger's narrative that it's a basket case. It is not. This is a place of hope, and people look at this image every day, twice a day, and of course they have hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for those insightful comments. Before I turn it over to the discussants, now would be a good time for people in the audience to consider what questions you might wish to submit via the WebEx Q&A function, or if you'd rather be seen or heard, raise your hand. Now, let's go to our first discussant, Sabrina McCormick, Associate Professor of Public Health at George Washington University. Sabrina.
Thank you so much. Brooke, what a wonderful talk. I have to say that I have not been involved in any kind of public event around Bangladesh since I was in Bangladesh. This is now 7 years ago. And I so appreciate that final image because I spent almost a month in a boat in amongst the Sundarbans and just falling in love with that nature and those people who I just have to say, I just loved them so much. Such a gentle, wonderful, welcoming people who we met across the country. So I just want to raise a few, I guess, three main points that Dr. Ackerly's talk really highlights for me. But I want to preface those three main points by expressing very explicitly that my interest, personally, as well as from the perspective of a sociologist and a filmmaker, is thinking about how we create a global society that thinks coherently about climate justice in a way where we can actually take action together, because climate justice implies, or climate injustice implies, the massive separation often between those who are driving or causing climate change, emitting greenhouse gases, and those who are affected by it. And Bangladesh is the case in the country that I always hear people raising first, and not maybe inaccurately so. Obviously, we've just heard about any number of effects of climate change. And so my points have to do largely with how we explore, navigate, and bridge that gap between those who are driving and those who are affected by climate change. One of the themes of Dr. Ackerly's talk that really is forefront for me in both my work and what I see in her work is the idea of prioritizing or valuing local voices, knowledge, experiences, and needs and agendas in that process. So Dr. Ackerly obviously makes the point that climate governance is multi-level. And as I worked on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of the chapters I worked on was about how we navigate these multiple scales of governance. And she makes the point that local voices are powerful across those scales, must be valued across those scales. And, I want to speak to how I see that being true in a couple of examples. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I worked on the years of living dangerously. I produced a story in Bangladesh that starred Michael C. Hall. We took him to Bangladesh and explored what was happening there across the country, with specific focus on forced migration, generally from the south to the north, and how that was affecting communities, both in the south and in Dhaka, which is the densest population-wise place on Earth. And, as we produced that story, I was constantly confronting this question of how do we value the knowledge, value the perspective, really tell, prioritize the stories of those local people, even more so than, to this point about big donors, even more so than, say, the ambassador from America to Bangladesh, who became one of the characters in our story. And this was a struggle because of this issue I raised at the beginning, how the intersection of those who drive climate change and those who are responded to climate change. So we knew, because the series was going to be on Showtime, that our predominant audience would be Americans. And to me, in terms of my goals, this was a fine audience, considering America historically has the largest contributions to climate change, now obviously reversing positions with China. And we really wanted to be able to reach Americans, to say to them, your lives have an effect on these people. And so to humanize and to hear, truly hear their experiences, and to present their experiences in a way that could reach the heartstrings of people who have maybe a distal, both geographically and temporally distal effect on Bangladesh, was very important to me. And subsequent to that, producing that TV series, I was involved in a large research project evaluating how this, actually the second season of that series affected audiences, their attitudes, their opinions, their behaviors, how we could actually reach and motivate audiences to act on climate change with documentary storytelling. One of the things that we saw in our results, which was very surprising to me, was, and maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was happily surprised, was that stories about people in China, India, those were two of our international stories in that season, really did affect the way that Americans thought. And when I say Americans, I mean conservatives, liberals, independents, everybody, the way that Americans thought about the risks of climate change and their responsibility to do something about it. And so what this showed to me was that truly showing these diverse experiences and giving voice to people who you might not otherwise meet actually can make a difference to the drivers of climate change and those who are really mostly responsible for climate change. I'll say also, I have just released in December my first scripted feature film called Sequestrada. That's on Amazon and iTunes, et cetera, in the US, and we're just in the process of releasing it in Brazil. It's a fiction film shot in the Brazilian Amazon, but starring American celebrities as well as local indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon. And in that process, we were attempting to do the same thing, really give voice to the experiences and stories and literally the narrative of those indigenous people in order that we could understand in that context what was happening there was the construction of what has now become the world's fourth largest hydroelectric dam and illegally displaced indigenous people in the eastern Amazon. And so that has continued to be a kind of a theme throughout my work that Dr. Ackerly raises about prioritizing, valuing, and telling the stories of local indigenous people in the context of climate change such that we can understand the effects. And in the case of the Amazon, how development, large scale, multi-billion-dollar development actually affects those people and how they might play a role in shaping development such that it is more sustainable, both environmentally and economically in that case. The second point that I want to make, and maybe I'll stop there because I realize I'm talking more than I had planned, is to this point about navigating multi-level, multi-scalar governance. One of the areas that I just want to use Dr. Ackerly's talk as a jumping off point for is the idea of the legal dimensions of navigating these different experiences, both the drivers of and the effects of climate change. So some of the work that I've done internationally has looked at the way that individuals, groups, and in particular children have brought climate change lawsuits to try to protect their future. We see these cases in Pakistan, India, the girl who brought a case in India actually winning in order to engender the public trust that the argument being that her future will be affected by climate change and that the government should therefore protect her future by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I have another film project based on the story of the 25 Colombian children who did the same thing in the context of the Amazon. Not only did they win at the Supreme Court level, but they also, the Supreme Court went so far as to treat the Amazon now legally as an individual. It should sustain the rights of an individual in terms of the protections. And this is obviously multi-scalar in the sense that the Amazon affects the entire world. And so the actions of these children have affected all of us. And so, you know, this intersection of the way that these lawsuits are bridging these gaps is, I think, highlighting more and more some of the issues that Dr. Ackerly raises in regards to how do we really create climate justice in the context of a world that does not have a unified legal system in which the issues, the complex, scientifically and socially complex issues of climate change can be effectively navigated. It is a very difficult and fraught process right now. And I'll just speak to one last project I'm working on, which hopefully will play a role in moving the needle on climate justice, which is it's both a documentary and a scripted project called Massachusetts versus EPA, based on the most important environmental Supreme Court case in U.S. history that was actually responsible for forcing the Environmental Protection Agency under Bush to address greenhouse gases as a harmful pollutant, and therefore resulted in the regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. The International Bar Association has put together the documentation so that that case can be used and brought by nations around the world in order to advance regulation of greenhouse gases at the national level and in any place where the legal system is sufficiently similar to be able to do that. So our film hopefully will play a role in advancing that, the proliferation of that legal framework around the world. So that is a kind of a different take on the empowerment of local voices, but more about the exchange of experiences that can also help bridge these gaps and create climate justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and I really appreciated your talk, Dr. Ackerly.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. So much overlap, so much in common, and seen so differently. Let's move on to Stephen Smith, Professor of Economics and International Affairs in the Department of Economics. Chair, let's go to you, Stephen. You're on. You must mute, unmute.
Well, thought I had, and according to this, I have. Can you hear me or not?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. So anyway, I would like to also thank Professor Ackerly for joining us at GW for this event, which we very much appreciate, and I'm sure we've all learned a lot from this. And so really this is part of some ongoing work, as I think Professor Foster indicated. We have as one of our signature initiatives broadly in Institute for International Economic Policy, economics of adaptation to climate change in low-income or developing and vulnerable countries. And so this is part of a long discussion that we have had here. So I have, so it's great food for thought, and I will just try to condense a lot of thoughts, stimulating ideas that you had into, maybe we'll call it 4 questions or something, which I'll try to motivate. But first of all, I greatly appreciate you were pointing out that Bangladesh is not a basket case. Quite a few years ago, I wrote a paper for a general audience trying to save that, and my editor changed what I thought was an okay title into a much better one, which was Bangladesh from basket case to case in point. And so there's really a lot we can learn from Bangladesh in a number of ways. So one of them, I think, has to do with the role of strong indigenous non-governmental organizations. So I was struck by your not bringing those up as a player, right? So we have it was clearly brought up civil society, because we have the local indigenous groups who are struggling in their in their agricultural and fishing and so on areas. We have the government of Bangladesh, which we could talk about quite a bit, and we have the international economy and global development players. But NGOs have played an extremely important role. They I think, are one of the most important reasons for making that transition that we've seen in Bangladesh from basket case to case in point. And so, and they may be part of what makes Bangladesh special, right? But just to give an idea about the scope of them and their importance, they're a large fraction of the economy in Bangladesh. and two in particular, Bracken and Ramin, represent very large players in the economy, and there are many others as well. A couple have gotten into big trouble by talking about politics, and so have been marginalized, I guess. But the local NGOs there very much, I think, and I'd like to hear your thought about it, have, I think, really emphasized the importance of local domestic inequality in their analysis. Obviously understanding that there's a global context, and in particular, there's the terrible legacy of British colonialism, followed by Pakistani colonialism, if you want, and so on. But but Muhammad Yunus, for example, the Nobel laureate, has emphasized that the reason that poor people stay poor is because the rich benefit from their poverty, right? So. NGOs, I think, have been engaged in an impressive way, and I would like to hear your idea about how they fit into this. Right. Another question that I have for you: you talked, I thought, interestingly about the iterative process between formulating a general understanding of what is happening and going back and checking. Does that conform to what you see very much on the ground? And I think that development economists often see it in a very similar way. But I'm curious, how similar, right? So the way that we would frame it, I think, obviously I can't speak for all, or I don't know how many development economists that I can speak for. So I'll just speak for myself for the moment, right? That there are hopefully, some good ideas about how to address serious development problems, such as of the ultra poor or the badly malnourished or others that you might see in Bangladesh. And so perhaps you get those ideas because an NGO is working on them, or because you have a conversation with people in villages that you go to visit. I don't know Southwest Bangladesh. I spent some time in Northwest Bangladesh, which certainly looks very different. But in any case, and so one has these ideas, and then there are hypotheses you want to test about it, such as whether a program is working or not to address the problem you have identified. And so you then organize some kind of research, which involves large-scale collection of data, right? And then from that large survey, 1,000, 5,000 people, you try to draw some very general inferences, so that you're not focusing too much on success stories, as many of the NGOs actually do, especially the US-based ones, love success stories. A few others actually are okay with failure stories. Some go to developing countries, it seems to me, especially looking for failure stories, because they sell or something of this kind. And of course, you can always find outliers, such as, someone is always going to be hurt by almost anything, right? But then you go back, and then you have these results. You go back and you talk to the people individually, and especially organized focus groups, to help interpret and understand what you found, and then go back and then do more work. And so that's, I think, how some development economists work. And I'm curious whether or not that conforms, or how it is different from what you had in mind. So that's another thing. So yeah, it's one other question had to do with your point about the difference between the immediate impacts of climate change today and what we're thinking about as the longer run ones, right? So I think that in some work in economics, there's thought about so-called analogs of climate change, or models of climate change. That is to say, inundation being one of them, inundations such as from storms, are giving us an idea of what sea level rise might look like, in the future. That's one example. Heat waves can give you an idea of what general temperature rise might look like. And so there's this, a series of those. And so naturally, that led me to wonder how close or not close that was to your idea in terms of looking at immediate impacts. Say it's not, this is centimeters, but now we're looking at meters, which is, I don't know if that's the same or different, but I'm interested in that. Regarding governance, I couldn't possibly agree more about the central importance of governance. And here, one of the things that we've looked at at GW as part of the IIEP research that I think James Foster mentioned before is first focusing on adaptation to climate change, because people, no matter what happens, people are going to have to adapt. And so we've studied development and poverty here and know less about the technology for carbon capture or something. So we focus on that. But within adaptation, we think about two broad types: autonomous and planned or policy adaptation, right? So, so that the government coming in and doing some of the things that you suggested, in terms of building seawalls or things of this type, that's planned adaptation. And as you pointed out, with respect to the things like the Burns construction, to have farming areas has spillover effects on those who are on the coast. So that's it. And then the people on the coast have to respond in some way, right? They have to over shrimp farm, for example, where you had to go work for a week instead of a day, or migrate. I mean, that's the most famous adaptation response to climate change. So what seems critical then is the nature and quality of this interaction between planned or policy adaptation on the one hand and autonomous adaptation on the other hand, because ultimately most adaptation is likely to be autonomous. It's what people are doing in communities, what individuals, what families, what community groups, are doing. And so I'm curious about how much or how closely or not closely that relates to your presentation and your ideas. And then my last question is actually to give you back your question that you hope to address, because I'm very interested with respect to sort of local common property organization in areas such as where there's irrigation going on, right? What works and what doesn't. So you said you had an exception that proved the rule, and you'd be interested in talking about it, and I would be interested in hearing about it. And so those are my questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Really great commentary, both of you. Brooke, you have a chance to reply to the discussants or have a few comments on what they have to say before we start hitting the Q&A session. Go ahead, Brooke.
Excellent. Well, so this is lovely. I'll answer Stephen's second question first, and if I've understood, I might not have understood what was at stake in your question. But I think what you were talking about there was the way in which people like the narrative, and that's why we get a lot of case studies in our U.S. philanthropy. And I want to tie that to Sabrina's work on narrative that gets people to care. And I think the reason why we see U.S. donors focusing on the narrative rather than the quantitative data is because the data show, and Sabrina may have this more at the top of her head, but the data show that people are more responsive with a narrative with no data than they are with a narrative with data. And in fact, if you have ever been at one of NGOs, and I've worked with 7 on this project, I'll explain the experiment and why I hand waved the NGOs in a minute. But the reason why the narrative work is so important, and I love Sabrina's work showing that it is important, because it's what people want to hear. And so if you are trying to change people's arguments, you really need to be able to make both kinds of arguments and maybe shelter them from hearing the arguments that they won't find as convincing. So I'm very impressed with your interest in figuring out how to tell both success stories, for example, in the legal sense, and then turning those into giving an account and a handbook so that people can really figure out how to translate theirs into their sites. So we did work with 7 NGOs, to answer Professor Smith's first question. We worked with 7 NGOs that were working in all of these sites. And the reason why I didn't talk about that is because one hypothesis that we had was that whether people had, and whether the people who took the project had a sense that it was theirs, that they had a voice in it, that they could hold people accountable. We had a hypothesis from prior work that I had done with BRAC and Grameen, Save the Children, and a smaller credit program. We had this hypothesis that it mattered whether the organization had a rights-based approach. The argument was that if you have a rights-based approach, you will be more likely to have a community take on a project in a way that they feel that they have the authority, the right, and the responsibility, in fact, to hold the construction firm, the NGO accountable. And in fact, we did find variability on whether the NGO had a rights-based approach. Again, not just in their discourse, but in what they actually did. But we found no variability on whether the accountability mattered. And that is because, or the sense of accountability mattered. And that is because of the other aspects of the governance. The fact that NGOs are functioning as part of governance and that there are these governance gaps creates that problem. In addition, as locally oriented as many are, and they are, but it is better on paper than it is in practice. Because all it takes is in practice for one NGO to have the main contact worker end up being somebody's cousin rather than somebody from the community, or somebody's from the community's cousin, you know, whatever. That's all it takes when you're talking about each organization having just one actor on the ground within the community for those kinds of, I would say they were mismanagement at the NGO level, but that's not the argument that comes out of here. That may be empirically what we observe, but the argument that comes out of here is that that is a consequence of misgovernance. And not misgovernance. Really, in this case, that's a governance gap, where you have a good idea, but because there's a gap between the good idea of how the NGO is going to work and the way in which the construction firm works and the way in which that entire system is nested in the, oh shoot, I forgot the engineering entity that's responsible for commissioning all of that. That is a government of Bangladesh body that holds the whole thing together. So that's why they fell out of the story, not because they weren't incredibly active. We were partnering with these 7 NGOs all the way along. And the one group that we were least connected with was JJS, which is in the furthest west, which was an area that had a lot of, this was before the more recent wave of Rohingya massacres. And so before that, the area of the West was really where the Islamic State was doing its primary recruiting. And so that area, they felt very vulnerable, and they were not interested in having our mixed team with some Dhaka people, some Khulna people. Khulna people may feel like rural people to the Dhaka people, but to this far western area, they definitely felt like urban people to those. So actually, my answer to your question illustrates my point even better, that the layers of governance problems, and whether it's clarifying to call it a gap or misgovernance, I think it's worth exploring to make sure that we understand whether it's a gap or misgovernance. So is corruption a gap or misgovernance? Well, if you act like it's not what happens, then it's both. But if you act like it happens and you figure out how to work within it, recognizing that it happens, then it's misgovernance at the level at which it's corruption, but it doesn't create a governance gap. But one of the problems that we had with this project is that the design, the university professor who designed it, he knew how much the cost structure was. Well, because he knew, so did UNICEF. UNICEF has a zero tolerance policy for corruption, but the government doesn't, right? The government and the government employees expect that people get part of their salary through that carving process. And so the carving process meant that the higher quality bricks weren't used, the higher quality cement wasn't used, and that's why things weren't going to make it through their warranty period, for example. I want to be able to open it up to the audience. Let me just check I love this idea of the analog, and I think I need to learn more how it's used in economics. I mean it. I use the word vignette from architecture. What I'm talking about is to use this as a way of seeing more clearly what is and will happen in the future. I'm not saying this is analogous to what will happen. I think this is what will happen. It is a gateway of seeing all the complexity that needs to be explored in order to understand how to play it out on the ground. I want to conclude by addressing the fourth point, and then, yes, sorry.
So go ahead.
Okay, so the fourth point was about adaptation. Is it planned or forced? What I'm talking about is constraints on the autonomous adaptation. That the planned approaches are so constraining of autonomous adaptation that much of what's possible is not possible. And the example that I was going to give was the way in which people, the old practice that is coming back and now has some external support is to do where you do these little breaks in the embankment for a certain part of the year so that natural sediment can come in and fill in the land, and then build the embankment back up. That is an old practice that is coming back, and it's a little too vulnerable to the conditions I've been describing in the region where I've been working. But in the area further north, where they have real problems with flooding, and the water there stays for a very long time, implementation of this plan creates these fields. This approach over time has shown to mitigate the long-term, really 50-year consequence of this sediment problem. And my colleagues have studied to show that actually it only takes a year or two of allowing the sediment back on the land to solve some of the inside-outside problems. Maybe I should stop there, but I think Sabrina's points about figuring out how to show a tidy narrative and yet not undermine the complexity. I may not do as good a job as she does with her documentaries in this kind of argument, but that is what I'm trying to do, is to clarify what's going on without oversimplifying. And I feel like the vignette, taking you there and seeing how it actually works on the ground, is the more effective way to do it than allowing those simple bathtub stories about how high sea level rise and who will be affected as being the dominant narratives that our policymakers are allowed to use. Thank you for these very thoughtful comments. It's been great.
Thank you, Brooke. I have a first question from one of our newest professors, Lucia Raffanelli, here in GW. She says, it seems that framing climate justice as a matter of dealing with objective scientific truths can obscure the governance issues that are really at its heart. But framing it this way may also be key to gaining support for mitigation or prevention. Do you have any thoughts on how to balance this political need to present climate change as objective science fact and the need to recognize the political governance issues at the heart of climate justice? We also have a second question from Asif Dowla. Isn't shifting the burden to governance issues giving a free pass to countries that are responsible for climate change? One could say it is a deflationary tactic.
Mm-hmm.
The floor is yours.
Excellent. So does climate change, you may have noticed that the discussion of the objective science of climate change is itself politically contested, certainly in the United States, and I think globally. So in a way, my argument is really directed to the already converted. So if Professor McCormick can be effective in getting people to turn their souls to care about this issue. My argument picks up and helps guide what we should be doing when we do that. Now, I do not mean to set down the responsibilities of countries that have contributed significantly to this problem for contributing to the solution. But when they contribute to the solution, they're going to propose doing certain things. The historical record is that they contribute doing what they do well, what they've used to solve other problems. So just to pick on the Dutch ministry, who've been very generous, particularly in the area of gender equality, which is another area in which I work. I don't want to diss the Dutch ministry. They are leaders in many ways, but they often lead with some of their technical expertise from back home. But if you think about it, there couldn't be a water condition more different than the coast of the Netherlands and the coast of the Bay of Bengal. And so to have a comparable solution related to polders really misses the construction conditions and the maintenance conditions, just stopping there at the engineered piece. Now, they are expert and they are working on that. So, but as you know, the way foreign aid works is they make the gift and they make partner with the World Bank to fund it, whatnot. But then, of course, what they want is for the experts who get hired to be Dutch experts, right? And that's normal. We do that as well. But as a result, we are already not focused on where we should be. Now, I have plenty of faith that Dutch ministry funded engineering experts from the Netherlands could focus on the governance issues as they propose these solutions. But I have no confidence that they will do so, and that they will do so while engaging with the complexity of those problems if they don't intend to. And so my argument is designed to have them intend to take up governance problems as if they are hard, as if they have been part of the problem to begin with, and as if in order to deal with them, we need way more than what we've tried before, which is a water development board, a community board that has gender balance. I'm not dissing gender balance. I like gender balance. But if you have an entity with little political power, it doesn't matter what the gender balance on the committee is. Nobody will have an effective voice. A voice, yes, but effective voice is what we actually need. Yeah, so that would be my answer to that. And I think maybe what I've done is conflated the two questions. I do not want to let people off the hook. Thank you for that thought, or countries off the hook. But what I want to do is to recognize that when they take up the hook, they need to do it in a way that is not in their own self-interest, but rather that they put front and center the governance challenges of being helpful. It's hard to be helpful well.
Okay, I have a question for you, Brooke, and we'll finish up within the next 2 minutes. My question is, it's clear that you are both academic and activist. How do you negotiate that? How do you maintain high quality academic output and not fall prey to a kind of corruption of a different sort, that the way that you think influences your results?
Well, I'm slow. I take a lot of time with things. Now, that may seem not empirically verified, but any given project actually takes about 10 years. And so if you see things coming out every 2 years, that's not because I change my agenda every 2 years. That's because they're finally finishing after a long time. And the reason why I start with I'm slow is I think it's important to really do that, that work of challenging one's own epistemology and of being recursive. But going back to a question that Professor Smith asked, don't you eventually need to stop being recursive and get on with the solution generation? And yes, I feel like on this particular project, I have taken too long in the thinking. That's on me. But in the data collection, I don't think I took too long. I think it was necessary to do the preliminary work. I think it was necessary to have quantitative data. I think it was necessary to go back and do those ethnographies. And then I think it was necessary to have a few different people try to play with these data and see what kind of patterns emerge. We do have, I guess I didn't tell you, 1,208 household surveys. And the idea was that we would be able to tell the difference in, for community, because we knew so much about each of these communities, the data were lumped by community, that we would be able to know if a community that had a lot of local activism was better able to manage the system and people were benefiting more. We have so much data about their politics. If we had some kind of correlation between that, it would be really great for helping us know how to solve some of these governance problems. And what we found is that these people are mired in so many levels of complexity that it's not possible, in limited ways is it possible to see community level data. So it was really important to be able to consider all these hypotheses and then to see what else the data could tell us and go at it from a different way. So I realized that this is not your standard, it's not a randomized control trial. We were not trying to ask one question and figure out if it was a success or failure. We were really trying to let the data talk to us. That really is my activism. If I am doing my work well, then I am not just being a good academic in how I analyze my data, but I am asking the questions that the people who are struggling with these issues are thinking are important to them, even if they never use these academic terms. So that's where the two come together. There's a practical answer to that too, but our time is up and you'll have to ask that another time. Thank you.
Thank you for that final comment, Brooke. Really appreciate your being here, and also to Stephen and Sabrina. Thank you very much. And to our audience, goodbye. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye now.